I was in the USAF stationed in Omaha in the late 80s. At the time I hung with my roommate and another friend. My name is Tracy. My roommate's name was Tracy. The girl we hung out with name was Stacy. When we were together, everyone always thought we were lying, and being the silly teenagers we were, we always found it funny. One weekend we decided to take a road trip to Kansas City, Missouri. We were speeding down the highway laughing and singing at the top of our lungs. We were happy and having the time of our lives. Stacy was driving and she had a bit of a lead foot and must have been going too fast because before long a state trooper pulled up behind us and turned on his lights. Stacy immediately pulled over. By the time the officer made it to her window, she had already had her license and registration in hand and the window down. The officer looked at her and then looked at me and Tracy. Then he said, "I want you to follow me. Don't try to run off or you all will be going to jail." He then went and got back in his car. Needless to say, the three of us were puzzled and talking amongst ourselves, wondering why he just didn't take Stacy's identification and write her a ticket. The officer pulled out slowly and we dropped in behind him and followed him down the road. He drove a few miles, then exited the highway. He drove a little ways and turned onto a dirt road that was surrounded by stalks of corn. We all stopped talking as we became more alarmed. However, being young, scared, and since he was a police officer, we continued to follow him. The officer drove for some time down this dirt road and then pulled into an area that had a big beat-up old barn. As he stopped and we stopped behind him, a group of men with shotguns exited the barn. It wasn't until that point did we realize we were in mortal danger and panic set in. The officer walked back to our car and told Stacy to get out and follow him to his car. As she got out, she looked at me and Tracy and there was sheer terror on her face. She followed him to his car and he motioned her to get in on the passenger side. She did. Tracy and I were crying, and as the armed men stood on the side of the car looking at us, we began quietly praying for God to protect the three of us. We prayed that Stacy wasn't being hurt and somehow they would let us leave. After some minutes, Stacy bolted out of the officer's car and ran back to the car and jumped in the driver's seat. She was crying hysterically. So of course Tracy and I began crying harder. The officer got out of his car and walked back to our car, this time to Tracy's window as she was in the front passenger seat. He asked, "Is it true all y'all are in the Air Force?" To which Tracy replied, "Yes, sir." The officer calmly said, "Get out of here and go back to where y'all came from. I better not see y'all again." As soon as he finished, Stacy turned on the car, whipped it around, and sped back down the dirt road. She somehow navigated back to the highway. As she drove back toward the base, the silence was only broken by an occasional sob from one of us. Stacy drove for a while, and as soon as we crossed back over into Nebraska, she pulled over on the side of the highway. Then she began to sob heavily. Tracy and I hugged her and asked if she was hurt in any way. She shook her head no. She wasn't hurt. After she calmed down enough, she told us what happened in the police car. After she got in the car, she offered the officer her identification and told him she was sorry for speeding. He took her information and then asked her, "What are you doing with those two N-words?" Stacy was white. She explained that we were on a road trip. He then told her that if she would do certain favors for him, he might let us go with a warning. At that, Stacy had a complete meltdown. I guess while he was waiting for her to calm down, he finally looked at her identification and saw that she also had given him her military ID. He asked her if we all were in the military, and between sobs she said we were. He asked where we were stationed and she told him off at AFB. He then told her to go back to her car. As we sat there after Stacy told us what occurred, I think it hit all three of us at the same time that the only thing that saved us was that we were in the military and stationed at a nearby base. We hugged each other and cried until we could not cry anymore. We didn't report what had happened. Again, we were teenagers and didn't think we would be believed over a law enforcement officer. We never talked about it after that day. That incident has haunted me for years. All of the what-ifs. But as I have gotten older, what haunts me more is the thought that others may not have been as lucky as we were. My company used to have another office in another state that was 2 states over. Most of the time, I flew there, but sometimes we would have equipment or vehicles that needed to be delivered. In those cases, I volunteered to make the trip and would stay at the other office for a week at a time. Sometimes, I would take a rest stop at a motel, and sometimes, I would break up the drive by pulling over to a rest stop and sleeping in the back of the vehicle for a bit. One time I was driving a big box truck, like a big truck you would rent at U-Haul. We bought the truck, it was used, and the back of the truck was filled with equipment and stuff from that office. I offered to make the trip. Unfortunately, the morning I was scheduled to take off, there was a delay, something I needed to take in that truck. I think it was a big copier machine. It didn't arrive till almost 3 p.m. After loading it in the truck and getting ready to take off, I knew I was going to hit rush hour traffic, so I opted to delay my leave for 2 hours so it would be after 5, and even though there was still lots of traffic, it would only be local in the vicinity, and once I got out in the open it was pretty much a straight shot till I reached state line. Having to pull over a couple of times to fuel and restroom breaks, I got into a rural area north of my state after midnight. I pulled over one last time that night for fuel and coffee. The next stretch was going to be very dark and desolate, so I was preparing myself. I knew there was a last rest stop near the border, so I pulled over there to use the restroom, stretch my legs, and maybe rest a few minutes before moving on. So I pulled up to the rest stop and it was empty. It is somewhat well lit and I was in pretty good shape, so I wasn't worried too much about my safety as I used to box. I go to the restroom and wash up a bit, but when I make it back to my truck, there is a pickup truck next to my truck and a guy is standing next to my truck. He starts to make small talk, then he asks me if I was having any mechanical problems with my truck. I thought that was odd, as why would that be a question? I get back in my truck and take off. After this point, there is a long stretch that is mostly forest-like area, kind of creepy driving through at 3 a.m. There is a bridge up ahead, a long bridge that, having driven this route before, I know that under that is like a gorge and water. All of a sudden all my lights in the truck turn off, headlights, instrument lights, even the running lights. I tap on the brakes and look behind me, even the brake lights seem to be out. Thankfully it was a moonlit night, enough for me to gauge what was ahead of me. I was sort of more angry than panicked, so I slam my fist on the dashboard and yell something like "damn truck." It was a Fonz move because suddenly everything came back up again. I drove looking for somewhere to stop, like a gas station, motel, shopping center, something, but nothing was in sight. I remembered a gas station I had stopped at another time, which was a city about 10 more miles up the road. I make it to that gas station and notice that shortly after I pulled in, that same pickup truck with that guy pulled over. Now he wasn't pulling up to the pumps, but I suddenly got this chill, like, did this MF do something to my truck? I started to put some fuel in the truck, thinking about my next move. Then just as I was about to get back in my truck and try to make it on, a cop car pulled into the station. I waved at it and got out. I make some small talk to the cop and point back in the direction of the street where that pickup truck was pulled over. After I do that, he drives off. I think I asked the police about the road conditions and asked them if there was a motel or something ahead. When I got back in my truck, I decided that if that guy had done something that might disable my truck, I better pull off for the night. I kept looking behind me to see if the truck was following me. I think it was, but couldn't be sure. I made it to another town a bit larger than the one that I had left, and there was a motel. I found a motel that was next to another gas station and checked in. I locked up my truck, grabbed my bag, and kept looking around me like expecting something to pop out. I get into my room and try to sleep, but keep looking out my window. I only slept a few minutes at a time, then by full daybreak I check out, eat breakfast, and head back on the road. I eventually made it to my office and asked them to have the truck looked at by a mechanic. I told them the issue, and they reported back to me after I was back home that the mechanic found nothing wrong and they never experienced the same issue. So this is probably far from the scariest story that will be shared here, but I haven't been on many road trips, so it's all I got. A friend and I were driving home from Las Vegas to San Jose overnight. We were getting pretty close to home, thank goodness, because this would have been much scarier if it had happened while still in the desert, when the car's transmission went out. He pulled off the freeway and into the parking lot of a little shopping center, and we called for a tow truck. It's about 3 in the morning. The parking lot is abandoned, except for 3 guys who we eventually noticed just loitering around in the lot. These guys end up very slowly approaching our car and surround it, one guy near the driver's side door, one near mine, and one hanging out at the back. And they just stand there for the longest time just staring at us. Eventually the one by my friend's door approaches even closer and asked him through the window if we had any money. My friend told him that we do not. He then went back a few steps to where he was and they continued to just stand there staring for several more minutes before wandering back to where they had been. All's well that ends well, but it was a disconcerting experience.